evening. Thank you all for turning. Evening also thank the candidates for taking time out of their campaign schedules to come speak to us as well. Take the opportunity to introduce each of our candidates in alphabetical order in terms of from the Conservative Party, Nick Hartley, Green Party candidate, Laura Ellis, Representative Nick Brown, the Labour Party candidate, and Wendy Taylor, the Liberal Democrat. Just to go over a few formatting ground rules, this is an impartial hustings being organised by Oxfam to give also you guys the opportunity to ask questions of the candidates from Newcastle East constituency. In terms of format, we will open up with a 3-minute speech and statement from each of the candidates. The first session of the hustings will be dedicated to the climate emergency. The second will be dedicated to poverty and inequality. Each candidate will answer each of the questions that is put to them and will have a maximum of 2 minutes to do so. We will start by asking questions which have been pre-submitted, and if we have time, we will hand over to questions directly from the audience. The questions that you've submitted to us in advance have not been shared with the candidates. I also want to make it clear that the questions that come from you guys in relation to us opening the floor must be non-partisan and also must be related to the theme of the hustings, that being climate emergency and poverty and inequality. So we'll start with the candidate statements, and we'll begin with Robin Gwynn, Conservative Party candidate.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you, Charlotte, for convening us. Good evening, everybody. Can I just check? Do I just talk at normal level? Can you hear me okay? I don't need to shout at you. It seems a long way away. Okay. I'm sure we're going to talk about a lot of critical policy issues. I'm looking forward to it. So I won't, in a sense, get into that now. I thought what would be best in my opening statement is just to give you a quick sense of who I am, where I came from, and what my angle is on these issues, including some personal career experiences I've had. So for most of my working life, not being a politician, I was working for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office as a British diplomat. I had 3 postings in Africa, in Kenya, Ghana and Nigeria, dealing with the range of diplomatic work, but particularly kind of conflict prevention, international development, good governance, elections, that kind of issue. And as part of that also, exactly 10 years ago, and I think this is why I was so interested in this debate, I did a job when David Miliband actually was Foreign Secretary. It was called the UK Climate Envoy for Vulnerable Countries. And it was in the run-up to the UN summit at Copenhagen, which some of you will remember is December 2009, so literally exactly 10 years ago. And the job in my case, we were trying to influence, if you like, the negotiating briefs that all the countries in the UN came to that meeting with. And as you know, that process is still going on. They're all in Madrid doing some of the same things again as we speak. And I'm saying that because I'd like to bring some of that experience into the room as we talk through the policy issues. The dynamic then was emerging was you had the developed countries who've done all the emissions historically. You had the developing countries and the small islands and so on who were suffering the impacts of climate change, but had not on the whole contributed to the global problem. And in the middle, you had this emerging group of developing economies, primarily China, who kind of used to like to pose as a developing economy with the smaller guys, but actually were really increasingly the problem. And as you probably know, China is now by far the world's biggest global emitter, although in UN terms it still likes to classify itself not amongst the developed, but amongst the developing economies. So dealing with all of that was part of my career experience. I have seen climate change impacts in Africa and everywhere else. Very happy to talk about some of the detail about that. It's sad to see in the news even this week the rains in northeast, sort of western Kenya and so on, because of climate changing literally, affecting farmers and livelihoods all over Africa and elsewhere. So I hope to bring some personal into this, but also obviously to deal with the policy issues as they come up during the questions. Thank you.
Hello. Voting for the Green Party is the most powerful action that you can take for the country and for the planet. Just imagine if I went outside and spoke to the first 10 people I came across and asked them, what words do you associate with politics? What do you think they'd say? Bold, committed, visionary, honest, trustworthy? I doubt it. Which is a shame, because most people go into politics for good reasons. But the shame is that again and again we get the kind of politics that leaves us without the fairer, safer, greener Britain that poll after poll demands. I joined the Green Party in 2015 because I work as a clinical psychologist in the NHS, and I see every day the impact of government social and economic policy on mental health, whether that be how we feel if we don't fit into the ideal, or if we flounder and there isn't a safety net for us. The Green Party stands up for doing things differently. Just look at Caroline Lucas in Parliament, standing up for gender equality, cancelling international debt, supporting human rights across the globe. And then there's the climate emergency and the ecological emergency, the biggest existential threats that we face. The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change are clear that if we are to have a 50-50 chance of avoiding a runaway climate crisis, we as a planet need to halve our carbon emissions by 2030. But in Britain, we benefited first from the Industrial Revolution, and so we need to lead, and we need to get to net zero by 2030 and get as many countries along with us. And that's why we support a people's vote, one of the reasons for supporting a people's vote on the terms of the deal of Brexit, because we want to stay in a reformed EU in order to hold other countries to account. America, Brazil, reverse deforestation, put an end to coal for good, and bring countries back to the climate talks. We want a climate revolution that guarantees quality of life for everybody. And we're going to do that with our Green New Deal. Our Green New Deal breathing fresh life into our communities so we can share our wealth, our jobs, our health around our country whilst protecting our planet. The global south are already being harmed by the climate crisis. And so our vision of a circular economy where gadgets and clothes are mended, where we're investing in safe walking infrastructure and public transport and cycle paths, and where food is locally sourced is the only vision that will work. It's the moral policy that we must take. So please, look, we've got 3 safe Labour seats in Newcastle. So do vote for what you believe. Vote for what you believe in on December the 12th. You can vote for stronger action on the climate, a fairer economy, and absolutely climate justice. So please, vote Green on December the 12th.
Okay, we now come to wireless.
And this is a statement from Nick, of course. The outcome of this general election will set the course for our country on climate change and environmental pollution. I believe these are the most pressing issues we face. That is why in May, I was the lead sponsor of a Labour motion in the House of Commons declaring a climate and environment emergency, making the UK the first in the world to do so. To properly address this crisis, we will need real change. Since 2010, Tory and Lib Dem inaction on this issue has led to the Committee on Climate Change to say that the UK is off course to meet its existing carbon budgets, which would ensure only an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. Cuts to renewable subsidies and effective bans on new developments have seen deployment of solar installations fall by 90% since 2016, and new offshore wind deployment fall 80% at the same time. Only concerted government intervention through a green industrial revolution can deliver the scale of change needed. Labour have committed to a radical set of proposals that will put the UK on track for a net zero carbon energy system within the 2030s. This vision includes a plan to build 37 new offshore wind farms, creating over 10,000 jobs in the North East alone. A Labour government will also ban fracking, invest heavily in public transport, install solar panels on nearly 2 million homes, provide 2.5 million interest-free loans for the purchase of electric vehicles, and support the creation of a publicly owned, locally accountable energy companies and cooperatives. Labour recognises the scale of change needed and would work internationally to address both the climate and environment emergency alongside global poverty. Labour will build on its previous achievements in this area by increasing spending on international climate finance to $4 billion a year and stopping all aid spending on fossil fuel production overseas, redirecting it towards clean energy. Another priority is addressing the disparities of wealth and income between the rich and poor in the UK. The Labour Party stands, as we have always done, for those who are not protected by their own wealth and power. A Labour government will work to end in-work poverty within the first term and rapidly introduce a real living wage of £10 an hour for all workers over the age of 16. In contrast to the cuts that have disproportionately hit the north, Labour will invest in our public services and put money back into the pockets of those who need it most. Ordinary people will benefit from lower energy, water and broadband bills, cheaper public transport and free prescriptions. I strongly believe that a fairer society can only be achieved through the Labour Party's programme to redistribute wealth and power and opportunity from the few to the many. And I hope that I can count on your support on Thursday, the 12th of December.
Thank you, Laura. And we come to our final statement from Wendy.
Can I firstly apologise about my voice? I'm very croaky. I have a nasty viral infection, but I will do my best. So I'm delighted that Oxfam have organised this event. I've been a supporter of Oxfam for as long as I can remember, and I think they do a huge amount of important work across the world, tackling poverty, poor health and injustice. The Liberal Democrats are very much an international party, so I thought I'd concentrate my comments on our international policies, although obviously I'm happy to discuss national policies later. I think the current liberal international rules-based order has created peace and prosperity, and trade has helped millions of people out of poverty and to live longer. But we know the system is imperfect and must improve to tackle global inequalities. We know, for example, that gender inequality remains widespread, and we know that climate change will disproportionately impact the poorest people and the poorest countries. The Liberal Democrat plan for the future is built on championing liberal and international values, ending poverty and promoting the UN Sustainable Development Goals in both the UK and abroad. We remain firmly committed to spending 0.7% of gross national income on aid, prioritising development that both helps the poorest and ties in with our strategic international objectives on gender equality, climate change and the environment, human rights, conflict prevention and tackling inequality. We would increase the proportion of the aid budget committed to tackling climate change and environmental degradation, helping countries mitigate the impact of climate change and other environmental crises, and obviously supporting climate refugees. We would pursue a foreign agenda with gender equality at its heart, focusing on the transformation of the position of women through economic inclusion, education and training, ensuring the lives of women and girls are not ignored in favour of trade or regional alliances, working to extend reproductive rights and end female genital mutilation, and ending sexual violence in conflict zones. We protect and defend and promote human rights for all, including LGBT+ individuals who are persecuted across the world, as well as those persecuted for their religion or belief. We develop a global education strategy to address the urgent crisis of 263 million children who are currently missing out on schooling. And we'd work through international bodies for better regulation and scrutiny of international trade and investment treaties to make sure they don't worsen inequalities or undermine human rights, or developing countries' ability to regulate the environmental and social impacts of businesses. On climate change, the Liberal Democrats have a detailed, radical and ambitious plan for the UK to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases as fast as possible and to set a new legally binding target to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions to zero by 2045 at the latest. But there's also a lot we can do internationally, because the climate emergency is a global challenge and requires a global solution. However, with the US withdrawing from the Paris Agreement and the most ambitious national climate policies falling well short of the agreement, we've got a lot to do. So we have got a detailed plan to lead global efforts to combat the climate emergency.
Okay, thank you to our candidates for their opening statements. We move to our first theme, which is the climate emergency. Just to remind you, we'll spend around 45 minutes in each session. We will begin by outlining questions which have already been pre-submitted. If we have opportunities to do so, we'll then take questions directly from the audience. And just to remind candidates, your answers will be limited to 2 minutes. So we'll start with the first question submitted in advance, which is: the NHS reportedly produces around 10% of UK CO2 emissions. How can we green the NHS to make it sustainable? Question goes first to Robin.
Okay, thank you. Well, I said I was keen to talk about policy issues. So I think the answer to that would be that, as has been said, the UK is the first large economy to legislate, in fact, for being carbon neutral by 2050. So there is an action plan to deliver that, and that includes the public services and the NHS being part of that. You will know that we've already managed to bring down UK emissions by 25% since 2010. I think during this summer, if I'm right, we ran without generating any coal, without using any coal to generate electricity for, I think, 2 weeks or so. That's the longest period for which the UK has done that since about the 1880s. So there is a downward trajectory. And I think that the work that is done within the NHS is very much part of that, contributing to the UK national picture.
Okay, Nick.
So I work in the NHS, and I'm lucky to live in Newcastle, where we've got the Newcastle Hospitals Trust. It's become the first NHS trust in the country to declare a climate emergency. And they have put together a very detailed plan about how they will go about trying to get to net zero by 2040, I believe. Now, this can be done in various different ways. We can look at transport to begin with. We know that 30% of our emissions come from transport. A lot of people are getting around in their day job in the NHS and using hoppers, using buses. The Hospital Trust here in Newcastle are helping subsidise the council to provide the first fleet of electric buses in the city. And there's much we can do as well around reducing our demand in the offices as well. So I think we find that you can change the way that we get rid of our waste. Unfortunately, there's still a lot that happens in hospitals where people are putting their rubbish into bins, and those bins are getting emptied, and those plastic bags are getting thrown out quite quickly. So we're looking at trying to change the way waste works there. But what I would say, and also there's looking at energy demand as well, and changing contracts when they come in line. What I would say is that what we shouldn't be doing is forcing the NHS to be in the first firing line for this. We've got, as a council, as a government, we should be doing much more to protect those services for the people, whilst helping on a grander scale shift the way we live and work, so that we can get our energy use down and live bigger, bolder lives. So people have to be harmed as a consequence of taking action on the climate, and I think that's something that we really need to bear in mind when we're talking about making these changes.
Okay, we next come to Laura.
So much goes into the NHS, so many different parts of it that you can talk about. With the NHS, which has been working more and more in a competitive way with private tenders, with competition for services, sometimes the overall picture can be lost on this. Certainly when it comes to transport, and people are quite often stuck using their cars when really there ought to be good public transport links. With waste services, where again that's often private companies that are making money from the waste services. With staffing, where staffing is under in many cases, and people have to make shortcuts, and it's hard to get a full overview of the whole of the NHS and the whole of the waste that can be incorporated in there. Energy as well. Of course, the NHS does use a lot of energy. If we were to bring that energy away from the competitive market, then we could also look at how that energy is created. With the Labour Party, of course, that would be through the Green Industrial Revolution, and we'd be looking to have energy from sustainable sources rather than wherever is just cheap and effective and therefore the lowest bid. So much in that question. Thank you.
Okay, and we come next to Wendy.
So I also work in the NHS at Freeman Hospital, and I have to agree that the hospital's done a huge amount to tackle climate change already. And one of the things we've done just in the last few weeks has gone what we call paper light. So we're not using paper anymore. Everything's being done on the computer. It's actually quite a struggle for the staff, but we're coping with it. Emails are now sent rather than letters. So there's the NHS Net secure email system. So we send almost all our correspondence via email. But I think there's a lot more they can do, and we can stop using plastic in the hospitals. They've made a start, but there's still awful lot of coffee cups being used when people ought to be using their own mugs. We've got the hopper bus. Yes, that's great, and I'm sure we could do more to make sure people use shared transport. One of the things I notice when I go through the hospital and always horrifies me is the number of lights that are on, the number of computers that are left on. And what I'd like to see is actually an energy and climate change champion in every part of the hospital. We can actually have competitions to see who can come up with a new idea. And I think that's the way that a lot of businesses have actually made progress, is to have those champions in place. So that's something I'd definitely like to see. Yes, obviously the NHS struggles, but we can do a lot. One final thing that I would say is that any new hospital buildings should be zero carbon, and really all our buildings should be in future, but that's certainly a way, if we're going to build all these new hospitals, let's make sure they're carbon neutral from the start.
Okay, excellent. Let's come to our next question, which is, can we tackle the climate crisis while continuing to grow the economy? We'll come first this time to Nick.
So on this issue, I think the Green Party sets ourselves apart from the other parties. No, fairy tales is what I would call infinite economic growth on a finite planet. We need to recognise that no matter how much we try and decouple economic growth from carbon emissions, we're still seeing CO2 rising 1.5% a year globally. Meanwhile, we need to be cutting it by about 7.6%. So we do need to change the way we look at our economic systems. And one way to do that is to start by measuring things differently. At the moment, everything's about our GDP. Now, GDP goes up if you have a road traffic accident, for example. We don't want to see more road traffic accidents just to get higher GDP, clearly. What we want is to have better lives where we're forming good relationships with our people in our community, to be living and working in ways where it's easier to get around, to have public transport that's more accessible, more attractive. So there's different ways of measuring. Now you look at what's going on in New Zealand, they're looking at testing this out at the moment. I'd recommend looking at Kate Rayworth's work on donut economics, where she's saying, look, when we're measuring our economics, let's think about let's imagine our finances a bit like a donut, where there's some outer boundaries, which is when we start to harm the environment, and some inner boundaries, which is when people are getting the basics that they need to look after themselves. We shouldn't be letting anyone fall into poverty, but equally we shouldn't be having an economic system that's all about money creating money and destroying the planet in its wake.
Excellent. We come next to Lara.
Thank you. I come from a pit village in County Durham. Pit closed there back in the 70s. Nothing replaced it. So many other places, the same thing happened. Now what we need to do is make sure that these communities aren't left behind. If you take away something, then it needs to be replaced with the industries that is good for the environment and also for the communities and the people, or we all get left behind. So the vision of the green industrial revolution would replace things such as often when I travel down by the Tyne, there are oil rig legs down by the side of the Tyne. Now I imagine seeing there instead windmills. So rather than just take away, we replace with something that is not only good for the environment, but it's good for people, it's good for communities. Growth doesn't have to be just about money, it can be about wealth of the people, opportunities, quality of life, and a future.
Okay, we next come to Wendy.
I think what's important is changing our economy, and whether that leads to growth or not, I don't think is the important thing. The important thing is making sure that our economy is green, and that means investing in green industries. So, in fact, Newcastle is very well placed to take green jobs. We've got a very skilled workforce on the east side of the city. We can bring in jobs, more jobs, in building wind turbines, building electric cars, insulating homes, renewable energy. There are huge numbers of new technologies that we could encourage, and we've also got Science Central, where a lot of research is being done on this area. So I think we just have to make sure that the economy is much more green-based, that everything we do is aimed at being carbon neutral, and I think we can make huge progress in that way.
And finally, this question will come to Robin.
Great, thank you, Tom. I think the core of the question, I think, was can you grow the economy while reducing emissions? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think that's a fantastic question, both for us and internationally. I'll try and cover both. First of all, I think the answer is yes, because it is happening in the UK. As I said before, our emissions are coming down quite significantly through generating more electricity through gas and also particularly renewables. Remember, 33% of our energy comes from renewable sources now. But our economy is also growing. And I think the key to this is technology and investing in research and development. So, for example, Lara, I think you mentioned the oil rigs and so on along the river, and Wendy referenced this. You know, there are, a dozen or more major companies already in Newcastle East that are involved in the renewable energy industry, as you say, from wind turbine blades and so on. So that rebalancing of the economy is already happening, where you can have both growth and reducing emissions. And I think the role of government, certainly the Conservative Manifesto says this, is to facilitate that by providing research and development funds in a proper targeted way. I mentioned the international dimension, which is that this is also an absolutely key question for developing economies, because again, if you flip over to the talks in Madrid and so on, a lot of those smaller countries are saying, well, you guys in the West, you all developed your economy on the back of very carbon-heavy industries. We need to grow, we need jobs and so on in our own countries. So you need to help us to find a way forward that doesn't involve going through a coal-fired kind of industrial revolution like China is at the moment. So again, there's hope there for technology. I think, as you know, in Africa, they talk about leapfrog technologies where you can actually go straight to renewable energy generation, which is helping African countries produce the power and growth they need and the jobs they need, but without going through very fossil fuel intensive growth on the way to get there.
Okay, thank you. Let's come to our third question from the audience. And it is, do you believe in external retrofitting of insulation on the outside of flats, houses, and houses to lower heating cost and CO2 emissions? And this question will come first to Lara.
I'm a little thrown by on the outside. Yes, absolutely do believe in retrofitting of insulation within homes, and the Labour Party has committed to helping that to happen. Our homes lose a lot of heat, particularly if they're not well looked after, and often that's the case if people live in private landlords or even with housing associations. We would absolutely be looking to do that, and for homes that are built from new to be built as carbon neutral.
Thank you, Lara. Next comes to Wendy.
Yes, I mean, there are a lot of hard to heat homes that don't have cavity walls, that are very difficult to insulate, and if that means external cladding, then we have to do it. I mean, it's very expensive, and we have to work out a way that we can do that, but it is essential that every property is properly insulated. When the Liberal Democrats ran the council, we actually managed to insulate 30,000 homes through the Newcastle warm zone, that was a big step forward, but what we're left with is the difficult properties. And we have to make sure that every single house that's already built in the UK is fully insulated. I would agree that any new buildings should be carbon neutral. I mean, why we're not building zero carbon homes now is quite beyond me. The Tories have had plenty of time to change the building regulations. It's very difficult for local councils to do that on their own because the builders would just say, well, we'll go elsewhere. But we must raise our building standards. We must make sure every single property in future is zero carbon.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. And we next come to Robin.
Thank you, yeah. So in the Conservative manifesto, there's a commitment to £9.2 billion of new funding to lower energy bills, investing in the energy efficiency of homes, but also, as we were saying earlier, hospitals, schools and other public buildings. I think, again, this is an area where we're probably actually going to agree a bit as a panel. This is an area where smart government policy can incentivise saving of energy on public buildings and homes, but also, going forward, the building and creation of much more kind of ready-made, if you like, energy efficiency homes. And again, for someone like me, I've read an article recently about, wasn't there an award given to a street or a set of houses in, I think, Cambridge, for an architectural award for actually developing and building and showing it can be done, a street of houses which were exactly in this area. And in a sense, I agree with the thrust of what Wendy's saying. Let's do that more and more. Let's have government policy that incentivises that makes sure developers are doing that properly. And, by public and private sector working together, I think we can definitely move in that direction, including with the additional money that I just said is committed.
Okay, and we next come to Nick.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to hear how so many parties are now starting to say the things that the Green Party have been saying for years. I mean, what I'd say is this is at the heart of the climate emergency. How do we keep our homes warm so that we're using less energy whilst also, tackling fuel poverty for those on the lowest incomes? Andrew Cooper, who's a councillor down in Kirklees, was talking about this many years ago, introduced a warm zone there, making sure that the poorest were getting access to that insulation. Yes, Wendy's right that sometimes that means about looking at the cladding on the outside of buildings. Of course, we do need to make sure that cladding is safe, and I think that should be very clear after what happened at Grenfell. We can learn from schemes such as the passive house model of insulation from Germany. They can keep homes warm in Sweden. We can keep warm homes here. What's important as well, of course, is that once we have them insulated, that we are heating those homes with renewable energy, moving away from those gas boilers, getting in those ground heat pumps. We can save people money and we can save the planet along the way.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we come to question number 4 from the audience, which is, what sticks and carrots do members of the panel envisage to nudge or coerce the population to move to significantly lower their carbon lifestyles? And the question this time goes first to Wendy.
Well, I think we have to start with the incentives, and the first thing we have to do is try and incentivise people to stop using fossil diesel and petrol cars and move to electric vehicles. And that may need subsidies, that may need a bigger scrappage scheme, but we do need to make sure that within the next few years we stop putting any new petrol and diesel cars onto the road, and that we just have electric or hydrogen cell vehicles if those come forward. I think there have to be some penalties. Obviously, that we can introduce some higher prices for people who are being not being carbon efficient. We can encourage people to. I think one of the things we could do is which we've promised to do, is to bring in a scheme for refunds on bottles and plastic that's returned to shops, cardboard that's recycled. Make it that perhaps put an extra cost on these commodities, so that if you don't recycle them properly, you will lose money. So it's a mixture of things. There has to be incentives. We have to take the public with us, but we do have to get behaviour change if we're actually going to make climate change work. And we need a massive education programme to make sure that people understand what they can do and take them with us. One of the things we did when we were running the councils, we actually had a competition for the person who could have the least waste in their bin. And we ran that, and that was very popular, and you got a small prize if you were the person who put the least in your bin that week. So there are things like that. There are things like a sort of a jumble sale, which is a give and take sale. So you can have people coming in and being encouraged to give away things and take something that they want. So there's lots of things where you can engage the public without penalising them, but in the end, some penalties are necessary.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. And we come next to Robin.
Yeah, thank you. So I think all of our parties, all governments will always be somewhere along this scale between forcing people to do something and not forcing them. And I think a Conservative government would instinctively always want to be on the choice of, on the end of giving people choice, freedom, information to make their own choices and so on. But recognising sometimes you have to do something in legislation and so on that actually does shift public opinion and practice as well. A good example might be good old shopping plastic bags. You know, it wasn't that long ago that we were all using them. I heard an interesting debate on the radio a week or two ago about the bag for life thing, the 10p. You know, because some people are actually just saying, well, 10p is not too much, so I'll just carry on getting a bag every time I go to the shop. So maybe that needs to be 30p or 80p or £1. You know, there's always a discussion about that. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, we come next to Nick.
Yeah, I'm interested by the idea that the Conservatives don't go in for nudges, because David Cameron was very much behind the behavioural insight unit that was responsible for some of the worst aspects of our welfare reforms in this country. I think if we are looking at nudges, if we are looking at making changes, then it needs to be done in a way that is transparent and clear. What worries me about some of the changes that have been proposed by both the main parties recently is that it feels quite hidden. Now, if you look locally in Newcastle, the proposals around the air pollution consultation, that there really hasn't been thought given to how can we make public transport more accessible. It's come too little, too late, and it's all about trying to penalise people. And actually, what we're now looking at is penalising bus use, which might lead to bus prices going up. I think, you know, the real change in culture, I think, has come from the young people, has come from the young strikers, has come from people like Greta Thunberg. That is what's led to a change in conversation. And I'd say that's much stronger than any kind of nudge psychology out there. If you see other people doing things and you see other people saying this is important, you'll start to see people making changes. And goodness, you know, since I joined the Green Party, I've made so many changes. So what I recommend is join the Green Party, come and find out what they're doing.
Okay, thank you, Nick. And we come next to Lara.
Thank you. Yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. People are talking about this now, and it's marvellous that it's become part of daily conversation, and that people are thinking a bit further than, oh, I'll just put that in the recycling bin. They're thinking about, well, maybe I shouldn't have bought that in the first place. There's a long way to go. The thing is, the way people's lives are, how hectic people's lives are, is one barrier to doing this. And certainly when it comes to driving cars and the public transport that's often not available or is often unaffordable, that's a big problem as well. The Labour Party would actually bring in free bus travel for under 25s. Now that's when habits often do get formed. So if someone is starting to use the bus and get used to using public transport, at that point they're likely to carry on. Even if they go off a little bit, they'll come back to that. But we also need to make sure that's available. So there'll be 3,000 bus routes restored that have been cut, because there are some places where you have absolutely no option but to drive or stay at home, isolated. There'd be a full rolling programme of electrification of the rail network, increased funding for cycling and walking. Again, that's something that needs to be developed while people are young as well. It's great getting on your bike when you're 50, 60. That's brilliant. But if you can be on your bike when you're 15, 16, and then form a habit for the rest of your life.
Okay, thank you. We come now to question number 5, which is, what are the candidates' views on climate change, emissions targets, and the new climate and ecological emergency bill? With that question, we come first to Robin.
Okay, thank you. Well, you'll be glad, I think possibly surprised to know that the climate emergency is recognised and referenced in the Conservative manifesto. As I said, we are already on track and we are hoping to continue that programme of reducing the country's emissions while maintaining and increasing even growth and employment. That includes 2 million new jobs in the green economy going forward, plus the research and development, I said. So I think, if you vote Conservative, in a sense you'll be voting to accelerate and maintain that programme. I don't know if there are further questions about, for example, the date of zero emissions. There's reference to Extinction Rebellion's 3 demands and so on. I don't know if we're coming to that later.
We have a couple that are along those lines.
Okay, well, in a sense, I'll perhaps come to that later, but I think my party set out a clear direction of travel. I personally hope that if, as I said, technology delivers more and more, again, for example, fusion technology, then that date of 2050 for zero carbon can be brought forward. I think we are saying realistically at this stage, we believe we've set an ambitious target. I know other parties here have different targets. Extinction Rebellion have their own views as well. We believe we put forward a measured, achievable target. But if the technology allows, then certainly we will want to bring that date forward. But also, as I said earlier, please bear in mind that what the rest of the world is doing is important as well. You know, I think in China, they are talking about peaking their emissions in 2030, not having net zero, but actually continuing to grow until 2030. Now, that is all part of the international negotiation. Sorry,
okay. We come next to Nick.
So I think this refers to the XR3 Bills campaign. Is that right? Is that what this question is to do? I'm assuming it is. Oh, right. Okay. Well, you were talking about declaring a climate and ecological crisis, an emergency, and absolutely, you know, we've been talking about the climate emergency. We need to think about the ecological emergency. These things are very much interlinked. If we look at our lack of respect for nature in this country, whether that be our planning and policy framework, where we've been building on the green belt and not really caring about what happens to our species that we're losing. I mean, you could list off the species, you know, whether it's skylark declining by 50%, a third of bee species in decline, 56 of British species in decline the last 50 years. We need to start things like rewilding. We need to start making room for nature by linking our nature reserves with nature corridors. We need to be putting much more emphasis on allowing that freedom for our species, because if we don't, we're just going to run the planet for ourselves, and that's going to end in disaster. Look at the floods. Look at what's been happening when we don't pay attention to our land across Derbyshire and South Yorkshire recently. You know, building on the floodplain has clearly caused a massive problem, and again, the main parties just don't seem up to making changes in the legislation. We need to make a difference. So yes, the ecological emergency is something we all need to start thinking about.
Very good. Our next respondent is Laura.
Thank you. I think we need to remember that according to the Committee on Climate Change, the UK is actually off course to meet its 4th and 5th carbon budgets, which would ensure only an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. There's been effective ban on new onshore wind development, which is the cheapest form of new renewable energy, because of restrictive planning. And new onshore wind development has fallen 80% since 2016. We really need to make a change here. A Labour government would put the UK on track for a net zero carbon energy system within the 2030s and go faster if credible pathways could be found on that. There would be a 250 billion green transformation fund for renewable and low carbon energy and transport, biodiversity and environmental restoration, and would deliver 90% of electricity and 50% of heat from renewable and low carbon sources by 2030. And of course, coming back to the wind farms, build 37 new offshore wind farms. That, of course, would be creating jobs, but profits from the wind farms will be reinvested back into further decarbonisation of our economy and coastal communities.
Okay, and next we come to Wendy.
Yeah, I think that there's two aspects here. I mean, there's the nature aspect and obviously climate change targets. I mean, we do need to protect our biodiversity. We do need to do an awful lot more to protect our countryside. So the Liberal Democrats would actually introduce a Nature Act to restore the natural environment through setting legally binding near and long-term targets for improving water, air and soil and biodiversity, and supported by a funding stream of at least 18 billion over the next 5 years. And we'd combat climate change and benefit nature and people by coordinating planting of 60 million trees a year and introducing requirements for greater use of sustainably harvested wood in construction. As regards the target for net zero emissions, the Liberal Democrats have a target of 2045. Now, we've been criticised for that, but what we've said is this would be a legally binding target, and therefore you have to be 100% confident that it can be achieved. We're very much an evidence-based party. We listen to the experts, and what they've told us is that the 2030 target is not achievable with current technology. For example, you can't go from 30,000 new electric cars a year to 3 million electric cars a year overnight. It's just not possible. Obviously, if new technologies come through that will help us get there more quickly, that's great. What actually matters, though, more than the target is what you do immediately. And we have to go right to the top. We have to say that there would be a cabinet minister in the Treasury responsible for making sure that we have a sustainable economy. We would have to make targets for every government department to show that they're actually achieving those targets. And we really have to make climate change the top of the agenda in every single policy. Obviously, it'd be great if we get to net zero sooner than 2045, but that's our latest target for doing so.
Okay, thank you. We come now to our sixth question. This one is a little bit longer, so please bear with me. The UK's climate finance hardly have contributed to the cause. UK's climate finance comes entirely from the aid budget. This forces developing countries to choose between building schools, hospitals and responding to the climate crisis. Will you support alternative sources of finance? And this question goes first to Nick.
Can I just have there's some, I don't want to be rude, but there's some chatter in the corner which is causing some of us not to be able to hear the questions and the responses.
Okay, thank you. I think points duly noted. Thank you.
Yes.
Nick.
So, there's a lot of talk about foreign aid at the moment from a certain party that isn't in the room, the Brexit party. Let's not talk about them actually, but who of course are wanting to do the opposite and reduce the aid that we're given to other countries. I think it's so important that we recognise the moral imperative upon us that we have benefited from emitting all of this, all of the carbon into the atmosphere. We now need to help those who are being harmed first. We're going to put up our foreign aid budget to 1% of GDP from 0.7, but also we need to make sure that it's getting to those communities, that it's not getting lost in kind of research or also corruption where it might not be getting down to the front line. What worries me as well is we've got this reliance on big donors and transnational corporations trying to help out, and actually we need to be doing more as a state. And I think that there's just that real recognition that if we don't, what we're going to see is mass migration from these poorer countries. Those people are going to be harmed directly from that, and it's going to cost us more as well. So there's a real financial demand on us for making these more, for increasing these contributions. For every reason, we need to support what's being spoken about, but also do more as a country.
Okay. Next, we come to Laura.
Thank you. We do need to do more. We also need to redirect what we're doing so it is most effective. What we'd be looking to do is actually do a full root and branch reform of the CDC Group PLC, the principal vehicle for encouraging private and sector in developing countries, and we'd be looking to transform that into a green development bank mandated to which would fight poverty, inequality and climate change. Again, it's not worth just doing more of the same. Of course, we'll keep up those levels of investment, those levels of aid, but we also need to look properly about how they're used and how they're used most effectively, and what we can do to help our neighbours, our global neighbours, in a way that works best for them. So we will be conducting that investigation, have a look at what's going to really work there.
Okay, and we next come to Wendy.
Yeah, as I said earlier, the Liberal Democrats are certainly committed to a minimum of the 0.7% of gross national income, and for directing a lot of that money towards tackling climate change and environmental degradation. But there's a limit to what the UK can do on its own, and I think what's really crucial is that we use any influence that we have in the world to work with other countries and to make sure that we have we take a leadership role, really. So we would support the Paris Agreement. We want international efforts to combat climate change, and we would, well, ideally we'd be staying in the EU so that we could use our role within the EU to set a binding EU-wide net zero target for 2050. And very importantly, we need to strengthen climate and environmental goals in our trade and investment agreements. And we must refuse to enter any trade agreement with countries that have policies counter to the Paris Agreement. We need to ensure that any aid we give is given to help countries start to manage for themselves. For too long, we've just given away aid. We've given, it's like the saying, if you give somebody a fish, they eat once. If you teach them how to fish, they can feed themselves. So it's making sure that the aid that you give is actually going to help those countries set up their own sustainable industries, sustainable environmental goals. And if it takes a bit more money, I'm sure the Liberal Democrats would be happy to look at that.
Okay, and finally we come to Robin.
Thank you. Yeah, well, the headlines for me are, as you know, the Conservative Party is committed to the 0.7 figure, having enshrined it and maintained it. That we are doubling our international climate finance, and that will continue. In terms of giving international leadership, I think, remember that this time next year, the UK will be hosting the same UN conference in Glasgow. So the work that's being done in Madrid as we speak will roll forward to enshrining and taking forward the Paris Agreement in new commitments to be made in Glasgow. So again, that's an absolutely classic example of the UK volunteering and taking up the mandate, if you like, to give it an international lead in these areas. The other thing is, this question in a way goes to the heart of what I was saying earlier about my own kind of personal experience of working in this area. And I think one thing we have to remember in terms of the volume of money, clearly there is, if you like, an obligation on developed countries that have caused climate change to help those which are now suffering the impacts. That's absolutely clear. But one of the reasons why many of the countries we're dealing with are poor is because they actually have difficulties handling their public finances. Maybe the money's not spent efficiently, maybe it goes missing and so on. So we need to be careful that we're not just compounding the problem by simply giving them more and more money just to make ourselves feel better, but not actually sure what that money is delivering. So I'm totally in favour of having the money available and finding the right way to spend it. But I don't think we should worry too much about having kind of beauty contest of how much we're going to give. I think the issue is we'll give a certain amount that we've obligated to. We recognise the underlying rationale for that, but that we want to work with receiving countries to make sure that they are able to actually use that money productively on various different adaptation measures, including drawing on our own technology to help them. But that we don't want to make any of those problems, if you like, worse.
Okay, and we come to our seventh question on climate change, which is, will you help to rule out the use of international offsets so that we can reach our targets by domestic action rather than paying developing countries to reduce emissions on our behalf? And the question this time goes first to Laura.
Sorry, can you repeat the beginning of that?
Of course. Will you help to rule out the use of international offsets so that we can reach our targets by domestic action?
We really need to do this ourselves here, and we can help other places around the world, but we need to take a lead on it here, rather than just say rather than just move things around. This is happening. It needs action everywhere. So there's no way that the Labour government would push that to one side.
Okay, and we next come to Wendy.
Yes, I think it's very important to stop offsetting our carbon emissions by giving them to somebody else. I mean, a good example perhaps is the airline industry, who are now trying to encourage people to offset their flights. Well, actually, that's not really good enough. What we should be doing instead is investing a huge amount of money into finding more sustainable aviation fuel if people are going to fly. And we would actually introduce a frequent flyer tax, so that you would actually have to pay extra if you had more than 2 long-haul flights a year. Possibly that needs to be even stronger. But we can't expect other countries to take our carbon from us. We have to do everything possible in this country to make sure we're reducing emissions ourselves, that we're making sure everybody in the country takes this seriously, and that we get our target through our own efforts and not through other people's efforts.
Okay, and we next come to Robin.
Yeah, wow, this is a really complex area, and I think it relates a bit to the earlier sort of half question we had about how do we help developing economies to grow without going through the same carbon-heavy route that our own economies have. So I can't say I'm against offsetting totally, but I think we do need to be careful that we are not kidding ourselves that we're reducing our emissions, if you like, at the cost of growth elsewhere. I think we're all conscious of that. Yeah, I would say let's continue to work in that policy space. And again, give people choices. So limiting numbers of flights and so on a year, I think for a Conservative government, that will always be most effective if people are choosing not to fly rather than being told they can't fly. And I did want to say earlier on that I now work in business, including advising companies on investing in Africa. And one of the main drivers now for people, for worldwide business, is the corporate sustainability angle, where they're very aware that consumers are choosing companies, whether it's food, clothing, all kinds of things, based on their sustainability criteria. And that's a good example of where consumer choices, your choices, are actually very actively and dramatically changing the way some companies behave. So I think I'm in favour of giving information and choice and allowing, creating a framework there for companies and governments actually to respond to what people are saying. It's a dynamic process in that way.
And next come to Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I heard it said from Kevin Anderson, climate scientist, about international offsetting is a bit like wanting to lose weight and paying someone else to diet. And when we think about what that actually means in practice, that's a really tragic situation that we found ourselves in. The fact that we have, that the Conservative Party's current target for being climate neutral doesn't include emissions from aviation and shipping. It doesn't include the consumption and emissions. All of those emissions that come from the stuff that we use in this country. And we do need to start to really look at that. And there's so much we could do. I mean, the Green New Deal that we're proposing is putting £100 billion a year into tackling the climate emergency. And that's the kind of speed and scale that we need to take in order to get to net zero by 2030. Look at what we're doing at the moment. We're subsidising the fossil fuel industry by £10.5 billion a year. So you talk about beauty contests, but we seem to be putting oil and gas up there on the stage in its whatever beauty contest people wear. I'm not sure. What we should be doing, we're only subsidising the renewables by £7.5 billion. So there's a real issue, and there's also a real issue about this being something of a class issue as well, which I think does need some explanation, some nuance. But what we know is that 10% of the people are using 50% of our emissions. When it comes to flights, we know that 15% of people are taking 70% of the flights. So actually, we can do a lot as a country to change without harming the poorest people. And that's what the Green Party keeps saying loudly. Sometimes it gets missed, but I can't repeat that enough, that if we're going to tackle the climate emergency, we can also protect quality of life as well.
Okay, and we'll come to our final question on climate change, which is the government has committed to end its contribution to climate change through a net zero emissions target. Will you back the urgent action needed to deliver this? And this question goes first to Wendy.
I mean, yes, I have outlined the fact that I think it's absolutely crucial that we take action now. The target is great to have. You need some targets along the way, but it's really getting started now to make sure that we move things forward quickly. So moving to 80% of our electricity being from renewable sources by 2030, moving to insulating all our homes by 2025, investing in green industries. I mean, we, as part of the coalition, one thing I'm proud of was that we brought in the world's first green investment bank, and that actually used about £2 million to bring in another £7 billion of investment. And that's the sort of thing we need to be doing. We need to electrify our railways, as has been said. We need to move to a lot more cycling and walking to get people out of cars, better public transport. We need low-emission vehicles, public transport vehicles. There's a lot going on in research into hydrogen, and it may be that actually we'll be having hydrogen boilers in our homes once the slight difficulties have been sorted out. But there's a lot of companies interested in moving things forward, so we have to take action now. We have to make it from tomorrow our top priority, and make sure that everybody understands that. The targets will then, I think, fall into place.
Okay, and we next go to Robin.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm also, as I hope I've been saying, in favour of setting ourselves kind of ambitious, challenging targets, and also having independent bodies which monitor what we're doing and say, actually, you need to do more, you need to go faster. So I think that's good. And that's the standard that the Conservatives are setting, and will continue to go down that road. Sorry, could you just remind me, Tom, the thrust of the question was about?
So the government has committed to end its contribution to climate change through net zero carbon emissions targets. Will you back this urgent action?
Thank you, sorry. Yeah, so we have set a target which is, as you know, 2050. As we've all said, it would be fantastic if technology allows that to be brought forward. I would personally be all in favour of that. I just wanted to say, maybe slightly controversially, there's been a lot of concern in the room, maybe it's not subject today, about so-called cliff edge Brexit. Well, I think and the economic impacts of that, we could, if you wanted, debate that to and fro. But what I would want to say is, if we set a carbon neutral target, which was in a sense too early, the economic damage to our economy would also follow from that. And I think maybe that's a debating point, but I think it's worth considering that we want to find the right balance between challenging ourselves but not doing harm to ourselves. And incidentally, many of the other developed countries in the world are following our targets now and looking to us as world leaders in this field. So I think we're in a good place, but we need to keep challenging ourselves. This kind of discussion is keeping up pressure on ourselves to go faster where we can, but to do it in a way which is realistic and achievable in terms of also protecting the good things are an economy that we're also benefiting from.
Okay, and next here from Nick.
Well, yes, I mean, I'd agree. We don't want to see another financial crash, but actually that could happen if we don't start making urgent changes, because we could see a sudden collapse in the oil and gas industry overnight, and that's when we're going to start to see the effects that you're predicting there. Our carbon tax that's in our manifesto is all about how can we make oil and gas financially unviable. And so if we're going to reach the net zero target by 2030, we need to be bringing in measures such as that. We need to be shifting to renewables and to support that through our tax system. But also, I agree with Wendy, staying in Europe would be helpful here. We could also set up a smart grid to connect the countries that are in and out of the EU, Norway, Iceland, making use of their hydro, geothermal energy, so that as well as setting up a load of offshore wind in Britain, we can rely on the network around Europe. We do need to reduce our energy demand as well, and we need to stop kind of throwing energy at some vanity projects like HS2, which of course is going to cost us about maybe 100 billion now, and also there's the whole issue around nuclear power, which we're probably not going to get a chance to get onto, but the Green Party are very clear that there's no space for nuclear power and we are very different compared to the other parties on this, if we are going to reach that target. So that's where we stand. I mean, So shifting to renewables, reducing our demand, and sequestering as well. We do need. I was talking about nature earlier. We're talking about 700 million trees. I guess we can get into a beauty contest about trees, which is great. But we need to do all that we can. And the manifesto offers the only clear plan out of the four of us that will get us there by 2030.
Okay, and finally, this question we hear from Lara.
Yeah, target's massively important. We need to do it now. Now, Labour government would put us on track for net zero carbon energy system within the 2030s, but we'd also be looking to bring that forward if we can find credible ways to do that without causing other damage. Nick's position's very clear. He's not yours, but yours probably is as well. Yes. Nick Brown's position's very clear on this as well. It's the most pressing issue that we face. He's one of the lead sponsors of the Labour Party's Opposition Day motion in Parliament, declaring a national climate and environment emergency, which made the UK the first country in the world to do so. He's spoken at events in Newcastle on the issue. He's met with constituents, including school children that actually came down for the big climate change protest. And he has also long championed a specific green industrial strategy for the North East. So that can help us tackle the unique challenges that we face as a region, but also allow us to build on our strengths. So yeah, we need to go as fast as we can on this. Targets helpful, but we also need to pay mind that we do this in the best possible way.
Okay, so that's it. Thank you to the candidates. As we draw to a close on the climate emergency section of the hustings, we now move on to.
Just have a couple of minutes to go and find some water because I'm
of course, yeah.
croaky.
Okay. Okay, so we're next going to move on to a discussion around poverty and inequality. Just to give Wendy a chance to grab some water with her kind of infection, just give it a couple of minutes before we kick off with the next set of questions. If anyone wants to take the opportunity to go for a loo break, obviously feel free to do so.
To a musical interlude.
Oh, would you start off?
No, as soon as I said that, everyone left.
Oh, thank you, darling.
An email I got today from Save the Children suggesting that on the election night, saying the 13th, where their Christmas jumpers to work to raise money.
I think it's doing okay. No one's complaining that they can't hear what we're saying.
The count might have already happened.
Just give them a couple of minutes to get people back into the room. Yeah, okay. Give it 2 minutes. Yeah, we've spent a bit longer on climate change. There's only 5 questions for property, so I thought we'll get through. Okay, give another couple of minutes.
I seem to start something.
Yes.
Just getting worse.
I appreciate it's not great having to talk constantly during the course of the last hour or so either.
No, it's just so frustrating. I never lose my voice.
No.
Worst possible time.
What's the best possible time for an election, either in the middle of winter where these kind of bugs are going around and increase people's chances of catching them.
I was talking to a group of politics students at the universities to do
Oh yeah.
very engaged and intense, and it was just me. So.
Yeah, lots of talking and seen plenty of questions.
Oh yes, we've got some greens, but then I've just took what our name.
look at your clock upside down. You can see what's happening there. Sorry, in my opening, I completely missed.
Charlie?
We're also focused on trying to give a good answer.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, we're just wondering how the national and international questions, but I guess I can do both. I know.
That's all I've
Okay, can all come to order, and we'll get started on our second theme, which is poverty and inequality. Okay, we will start with first submitted question on this topic, which is, do you agree with the Hexham MP candidate, which I'm assuming referring to Guy Opperman, in that relation to food banks, poor people need to manage their finances better? If not, what are the causes of poverty? We'll go first to Robin.
Okay, is this 2 minutes again?
Yes.
There's a lot to cover in this. I mean, first of all, no, I don't agree with that bold statement. I don't know what the context was. I don't agree with it. Again, there's no way I can stand here and tell you what the causes of poverty are. Obviously, they're extremely complex and so on. What I will say is that as Conservative government, we are doing what we can to grow the economy, to raise tax thresholds, to put money back into people's pockets. But you'll appreciate, I'm sure, this is a difficult one for me, because I think there's a national picture and there's a local picture and there's a regional picture. I think nationally, there are statistics that show the economy is growing, that there's never been more people in employment and so on. But many of you will say to me, yes, but that's not true in the North East, it's not true in Newcastle East. There are figures going up, I'm sure, well, I know, for the use of the Newcastle East Food Bank and so on. So I think I'll say that there is a genuine challenge, to be very honest here, for my party, I think for all of our parties actually, for whoever comes out as the winner by this time next week, whether that's in this constituency, across the region or nationally. There is a real challenge to start to mend some of the gaps and things that have been growing up. For my party, there's a challenge to have policies that, if you like, work for people across the country. There may be many of you thinking, well, you've had lots of years to do that. I'm just being honest with you and saying, I think we need to start to put public services back together. I can give you lots of statistics if you want about how much money we're putting into the NHS, schools and so on. You can read all about that in the manifesto and so on. You'll probably hear it from the party leaders, listen to the debate later tonight. But I think I accept that challenge. I think it's an important thing that we all need to work on, and I hope and would want to work for my party, certainly, to rise to it.
Okay, we next come to Nick.
Yeah, no, so I found it really depressing when I heard what he had said, and I know another Conservative candidate has made a similar statement down south somewhere, which I saw the video of yesterday. I mean, this is part of why I got involved in politics, because I work as a clinical psychologist and I see the impact of poverty on people's mental health every day, and it's frightening that we live in the sixth largest economy and we aren't spreading that wealth around. It's as simple as that. We aren't, the cause of poverty is we aren't giving people the decent, just enough money to survive, to eat and to put themselves in homes, and it really does disturb me. The situation we're in at the moment, and now we've got Conservative MPs just being blatant about it, being blatant about their view. I'm glad that you don't agree with him, but unfortunately, too many people do seem to in the Conservative Party. Where to start? I mean, look, the Green Party do stand up for doing things radically different on this. We've got the universal basic income as a core policy, which is saying, look, people should have a right to money to cover those costs for food and for housing and for clothes. £89 a week, it's something that we can do just by changing the way our economy is structured. We need to get rid of things like benefits, sanctions and means testing. It's awful. Really, when you see the impact on people who are trying to make their way in the world. So many people I've met who, have been told that they are fit to work because they can get to the job centre to get their basic benefit. And it's disturbing. It really is. And look, I'm not speaking very coherently on this because it really rocks me and stirs me up, and it's upsetting, and it needs to stop, and we need to change it. So whatever happens on December the 12th, this nasty system needs to be put to bed forever.
Okay, we next come to Lara.
Isn't it horrific? Isn't it horrific that a few years ago none of us knew what a food bank was, and now it's on our lips every day. I was at a food bank just yesterday. I work with people who rely on food banks, people who not only do they have to use the food banks, but they get together and they do sponsored walks and they collect food up to take to food banks because they know that it's the people sitting next to them that are going to need to use it next time, or they'll need to use it next time. The truth of it is that the divide has become so big between the wealthy and the poor. I think that divide is so big that the wealthy can't even see the poor anymore. I speak to people that I work with that have actually said to me, they just want us to die and then we won't be a bother to them. And when they've said that, the people around haven't gone, oh, don't be daft. They've just gone, yeah. Because that's what it feels like when you're right there at the bottom of the rung. What have we got? We've got the richest 1% of people in the UK own more than 20 times the wealth of the poorest 20%. We've got children going hungry. Charities are looking at aid for children in this country who are going hungry, who are going cold, who are shivering on the way to school because they don't have a coat. One thing that I get emotional as well with this. One thing that had me crying the other day was when I saw a letter that had been left in a community centre box. This was just online, I didn't see the actual letter, where a girl had asked Santa for a home for her family, for food for her family, and she'd like a doll as well.
Okay, and finally we come to Wendy.
Yeah, I certainly don't agree with that comment, and it's an utter disgrace that in the 21st century anybody should be using a food bank, and we have to stop that. We need to tackle poverty. I mean, there's lots of causes of poverty, obviously. There are a lot of people who do struggle to work, possibly because of mental health issues. The Liberal Democrats would put a massive priority on mental health, and we want to see mental health treated in exactly the same way as physical health, with strict targets for treatment. But we also need to sort out our benefits system, and we've planned to invest £6 billion a year to make the benefits system work for people who need it. And we would reduce the wait for the first payment from 5 weeks to 5 days. I mean, it's utterly ludicrous that anybody should be left without any money for up to 5 weeks waiting for their first benefit. We'd also want to introduce a principle of universal access to basic services. We need to build at least 100,000 social homes a year to allow people to own their own home or rent their own home. We'd want to end rough sleeping and bring in a new legal right to food. And we'd certainly sort out work assessments. I was talking to a neighbour recently whose husband is dying from cancer. She's off work looking after him. She went to her work assessment interview. She felt degraded and abused by the whole system. She was told she had no points, and she said, and what if I was suicidal? They said, you can have 3 points for that. You've got to have 15 to get the extra money. You know, and it's just an utter disgrace that we've allowed the system to get that bad. So we have to fix our benefit system quickly. We have to, if we're going to keep universal credit, then it has to work properly. It's not, I think the basic idea was right, but it's been implemented in a ludicrous way. And it has to be that you get your money when you need it, as long as you need it, and you get help to work. And another thing we do is make sure that asylum seekers are allowed to work after 3 months of being in the country, because it's ridiculous to allow them to skilled people to just sit at home doing nothing when they want to be working.
Okay, thank you for those answers. Our second question takes a more kind of international theme in relation to poverty and inequality, and the question is, would you support a globally agreed minimum corporate tax rate to help prevent companies avoiding tax, particularly in developing countries? And this question goes first to Nick.
Let me think about that. Yes, I absolutely would. One of the problems that we have is that whenever we try and make tax changes in our country, people say, oh, but they're going to go off and take the wealth abroad. And I do think that's kind of assuming that everyone's really selfish and doesn't want to help each other. And although, as we've heard, there are some MPs in certain parties who clearly think that way, I do think the majority of people actually recognise that tax is a cornerstone of a functioning society. When it comes to corporation tax, the Green Party want to put it up in line with the OECD average to 24%. And actually, I think we can work together with other countries around the world to make sure that, corporate tax is at the same level. We can tackle some of the problems that have been caused by these multinational, transnational companies who, are probably, people like Mark Zuckerberg. He says all the right stuff, doesn't he, when he comes out and speaks, and yet he doesn't pay his taxes. So I think these people probably, I like to believe that they are publicly spirited, but the system is set up so that they then try and game everything to keep as much money as possible. I think if our politics was more compassionate, if our politics trusted people a little bit more, and I think we can do that by devolving power more. I think that's why I love the Green Party's policies on this, is that if you go back to the communities and say, actually, let's see what you want for yourself so we can keep wealth within communities, then I think that does trickle out, and like trickle down economics, and we then will have a fairer, safer world. So yeah, I wasn't sure when I started that question, but by the end, I'm pretty on board with it.
Okay, and we next come to Laura.
We often find that that blame tends to go downwards to the people on the ground when it comes to you're avoiding paying for this, you're avoiding paying for that. But the many billions that are avoided in tax from rich individuals but also companies is absolutely horrific. The Labour government would promote fairer international tax rules, and it would also help countries in the global south to build progressive tax systems. There's no harm in tax. Tax is a good thing. Tax is a way of sharing things out, so we don't have this enormous disparity that then, bring it back to the last question, that then causes the poverty. Thank you.
Yeah, we next go to Wendy.
I wish I shared Nick's belief that everybody is in it for the public good. Unfortunately, there's a whole industry of people whose whole aim is to allow rich individuals and companies to avoid paying tax. And what we have to do, first of all, is close all tax avoidance and tax evasion loopholes, both in this country and globally. I'm not sure about the specific tax. It's certainly worth looking at, but we need to look at whatever we can do to make sure that we stop this. And one idea that the Liberal Democrats have had we will certainly champion global anti-corruption initiatives, but we think it would be a good idea for all UK and British overseas territories to have publicly accessible registers of beneficial ownership of companies registered in their jurisdictions, so you could go and see who was trying to avoid tax by moving to one of these offshore havens. It just has to stop. We have to make sure that everybody pays their fair share of tax, and that means that the poorer people would get a better deal because that tax would be coming into the public coffers and being used to help them.
And finally, for this question, we come to Robin.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think the original question was whether there should be a link between a minimum international tax rate and less tax avoidance. I'm not sure there is that link, actually, and I think probably for the health of the world economy, on the whole, countries should be able to set their own economic conditions. I think one of the issues we've got with the Eurozone is that you see countries which are actually very different economically being locked together, and it's causing real stresses and strains. I think the key to this more is exactly how we harvest the right amount of tax from including companies, which I think Conservatives agree with everybody here. There are companies which should be paying more in the countries where they are generating wealth and benefits for themselves. And I think that work is going on. Ditto, Wendy, on the beneficial ownership of companies in British overseas territories and so on. That work is ongoing. And I think working together intergovernmentally to close down the space for countries to avoid that or to play off each other and so on is very much the way to go and is happening. If I've got a couple of half minute, I'm just going to say I'm glad we're having a good discussion here, but I think, Laura, I just have to say that quote you had earlier about, wanting poor people, do people want poor people to die so there aren't a problem anymore? I think that was a little bit, going a bit far. I mean, I don't know, I don't sound like I'm taking that very personally on behalf of my party, but I don't know that having that kind of discussion and language is helpful. I think we need to find a way to move forward.
She's
Sorry.
quoting someone who said that.
Yeah, okay.
So she's given a voice to people who
Yeah.
are voiceless.
Okay, no, I understand. I'm sorry that people feel like that, but as I said earlier,
Okay.
as I said earlier,
The point's been made.
I think there is a genuine challenge, certainly to my party. I do accept that, and I think Wendy also articulated this well, that where we have systems which are delivering negative and perverse benefits to people, even if the systems themselves have some broad acceptance, then we definitely need to look at why that is happening and fix them. I totally agree with that.
Okay, we now come to our third submitted question in relation to inequality and poverty, which is, would you support a review of wealth taxes to ensure they are fair and can raise revenue to fund public services that are vital to tackling poverty? And this question goes first to Lara.
Yep, we want to make the system fairer, and a fair system would tax the richest and would support the poorest. It really couldn't be much simpler than that. That most people would find themselves better off underneath a Labour government. The vast majority would find themselves better off, and often in ways that aren't immediately apparent as well. Because if we have taxation at the right levels, then we are more able to provide the services that help wealth, that help the wealth of the people, the wealth, the health, the well-being of the people.
Okay, and we next come to Wendy.
I think you have to be careful. I mean, I do think you need to support the people at the bottom first of all. We were the party that introduced the idea of having the first £10,000 you earn tax-free, now gone up to 12,500. We're the party that's saying you need to pay more in income tax to get good public services. So a penny on the pound on income tax would tax the rich more than the poor. But there can be unintended consequences, and just to give an example, if you look at doctors who are being penalised on their pensions if they earn too much, the result is that people are retiring early, stopping work. It's exacerbating the lack of doctors within the NHS. We have appalling crises in a number of specialties across the northeast, such as vascular services and radiologists, and it's a crazy system where you could actually end up paying more for working more. You actually lose money by doing more work, and that's not going to incentivise anybody to actually work more. But I'm happy to look at increasing tax on the richest. I certainly, as a doctor, feel that I should pay perhaps a little bit more. I've got a good salary. I'm very happy to pay a bit more for those good public services that we all need. And certainly, I'd be happy to look at any proposals.
Okay, we next come to Robin.
Thank you. Yeah, well, that doctor's pension thing is specifically being addressed in our manifesto for starters. On the question of redistribution and balancing, I mean, I think again, we're kind of broadly all in favour of that. I will just say, remember some of the statistics and facts as well. And primarily, it is a fact that in the UK, the richest 1% of the population pay 29% of income tax at the moment. If you don't believe me, you can Google it. It is true. I mean, I find that amazing, but it is true. So remember that there is already some burden sharing going on. The other thing I would say is if we're talking about redistributing income within the country and so on, let's examine what the different parties are saying. I think, again, it is a fact that I think a lot of the Labour policies are popular, probably, in some like free everything, free broadband. But actually, if you give free broadband as an example to everybody, that is not a redistributive tax. There's lots of people. I mean, Wendy's been good enough to say you're on a good salary. Do you need free broadband? I don't think so. I run my own business. I'm not looking for that. So it's nice to have some of this stuff. But I think for a party that is talking about closing income gaps and redistributing, let's be really clear what they are promising the public, whether it's delivering what they want or whether it's actually, not really doing that under the guise of being a populist policy.
Okay, and come to Nick.
So I'm 35, and I think for me and anyone younger than me, you'll probably find that how much money you have in the bank is a bit of a lottery based on how wealthy your parents are. And that is a system that we just can't keep allowing to go on. No one can afford to invest in putting down money on a mortgage if they haven't got some help from the bank of mum and dad. So what the Green Party is saying is, okay, maybe the rich people are paying some tax, but that tax isn't getting to the people who need it. And so we've got a clear plan for taxing assets as well as income. So we're consolidating national insurance, capital gains tax, inheritance tax, dividend tax, the money you pay on shares, as well as income tax. And that'll be taxed at the same rate that our income tax is now, but it means it stops people trying to avoid income tax by moving your money around. And also the land value tax, because what we've also got is this situation where property and land is also used as wealth. So, you get developers buying land, sitting on it. People are then, people with great ideas are putting in green public transport around that land, and that land gets more expensive, and so they don't build on it because, it's going to give them a return. We want to stop that by putting a land value tax so that people are then contributing money back into that community. It stops them from holding on to it. It allows them to then to sell that on or to build on it and use it so we can tackle our homelessness problem. And we're using our resources based on what people need. So what we've got at the moment is a system that's all about trying to keep money and hoarding money and getting economic growth. No, we need to stop that. We need to think, what are the needs of the people on the planet, and go towards those values instead.
Okay, we come to, which was the final pre-submitted question in relation to poverty and equality, which is, will you support tax policies that enable developing countries to raise money more fairly and sustainably in order to fund public services that are vital to tackling poverty in those countries? The first question comes to Wendy.
Yeah, I mean, that seems an eminently sensible policy to support. It's not one I'd come across before, but yes, I'd be very happy to support that. Obviously, we need to do everything we can to enable developing countries to achieve their potential. They need to get help with development. We need to make sure that the money we give them and the advantages we give them are used to become more independent. And because we've caused a lot of the problems in developing countries through our policies throughout the years, through the British Empire and other empires that existed. We have to put that right, and if that's the best way to do it, I'd be very happy to support it.
Okay, next come to Robin.
Okay, thanks. So, like I said earlier, I spent quite a lot of my career years trying to help countries, as best we can as external actors to grow and develop and become more prosperous. I think there are a lot of issues of leadership in there, and there's only so much that can be done from the outside. Wendy, the last point you just made, sorry, could you remind me? I'm going to take issue with it. Sorry.
Oh, was that about the empire? Yes, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Exactly. Right. So I won't go into the empire, but I think one of the, slightly closer to home, one of the issues that developing countries have at the moment is that, and I know this from my African experience, they can export lots of raw materials to the EU, but as soon as they manufacture them or develop them, we slap a big tariff on. And I'm afraid the common enemy there is the good old EU customs union and the common external tariff. So again, there are parties who are saying we must desperately stay in customs union to protect our jobs. Actually, that is a protectionist zone if you're outside it for developing economies. So again, I know in a sense that's not the thrust of the question, but I firmly agree, again, with actually something Wendy said earlier, that we want to help countries move beyond aid. The current Ghanaian president, who I know talks about Ghana beyond aid. That's a fantastic aspiration to have. It will benefit everybody when we are trading with countries rather than aiding them. But I think we need to look sometimes at some of the complex global components which are preventing countries like Ghana actually developing more quickly. And this business of global tariffs and how a country like Ghana relates to the EU and the UK in trading terms is very much part of that overall dialogue.
Okay, and we next come to Nick.
Yeah. So actually, you've got a point there about the EU. I fully acknowledge that the EU can be seen as a bit of a rich countries club that's be very detrimental to countries in the global south. Unfortunately, in the whole conversation that's going on around Brexit, I don't hear about how a post-Brexit Britain is going to help us move towards being the kind of country where we can start to help countries in the developing world trade with each other, make use of their resources for themselves rather than feeling that they have to sell to our country in order to try and make enough money to survive. And I think this is the problem, isn't it, of free trade. And at the heart of free trade, we've got a system that leaves developing countries poorer as a consequence, and we need to change that in some way. And unfortunately, we seem to have countries around Europe at the moment who aren't asking those questions, those hard questions of themselves. I think there's a real climate issue at the heart of this as well. If we don't do something about it, then actually a lot of this land is being used to finance our lives in the global north, and that isn't going to get us to solve the biggest issue of our time.
Okay, and we next come to Lara.
Yeah, we absolutely just what our neighbours were all sharing this planet. What hurts a person on the other side of the world is as painful as what hurts the person that's sitting next to you now. And there are many different creative ways of doing this. Certainly some of the things that the Labour government would introduce or develop is to stop aid spending on fossil fuel production overseas, but not just take that away, redirect it to clean and renewable energy. Establish an aid-funded food sovereignty fund. Look to support sustainable local food and agriculture markets, and take a tough stance as well, rejecting trade agreements that undermine labour standards or environmental protections. We all carry around bits of the rest of the world with us. If you've got a mobile phone, that's come from all over the world with all sorts of people working on it. And it's just sitting there in your pocket. There is a link between us and everyone else in the world, and we need to look out for us all, look out for our neighbours no matter how far away they live. We can do that in many ways, and certainly that's something that the Labour government would absolutely be working hard to make sure that there is more equality throughout the world.
Okay, we have time for just one final question. This is from our miscellaneous category, but it does link closely to what we've been discussing in this last session on poverty and inequality. So, the question is, what are your foreign aid commitments, and where and what are you aiming to achieve? The question goes first to Robin.
Okay, well, I think as you say, we have touched on quite a lot of that. I mean, we are maintaining the 0.7 commitment. We are continuing the current direction of travel. We will continue to help countries, as we said, to move to the Beyond Aid agenda. I don't know that any UK aid is being spent on fossil fuel development abroad, but I know that quite a lot, including through CDC, which was mentioned earlier, is being spent on developing renewable energy projects and so on. Like I said earlier, I think we need to keep an eye on the ability of countries to receive the amount of money that we have available to provide. Remember, because our economy is growing, the 0.7% gets bigger every year, so we have more and more money to spend, if you like. So we need to be very careful on the projects that we find to do that. So I think under a Conservative government, you will see that process continuing, and we will, of course, mention climate earlier on. That's very much a part of our thinking, both in terms of helping countries to adapt to the impacts they're already feeling and to mitigate some of the aspects through investment in technology and so on going forward.
Okay, and go to Nick.
We need an international Green New Deal, don't we? You know, foreign aid is all about trying to tackle inequality and tackle the climate crisis. That needs to be at the heart of what we're doing right now. We need to try and work together as a globe on this, where the aid that we are offering and working with other countries, because I think we need to be careful about being paternalistic on this. It's about trying to understand what are people's needs around the world and making sure that we can make lives better whilst also tackling the climate crisis. At the moment, there's more money flowing back to the north in terms of repayments on debt than there is flowing to the global south in terms of aid. So we've clearly got our system stacked in the wrong way. And I think, you know, when you look at the situation that we're facing, unless we make a radical change, we aren't going to get there. We've got a clear plan and manifesto for what we can do in the country. As I was saying, we've got the right speed and scale to get to carbon neutral by 2030. I think you can trust the Green Party on being the first to try and work with other countries to get there too, because it's pointless if we're just doing it alone.
Okay, next come to Lara.
Spoken a fair bit about age. I think also we've got to look not only at how we can help, but what harm we have done as well, and to stop harming in the rest of the world. For example, with arms exports, the kind of harm that can bring about, not just out there on the battlefield, but what comes afterwards as well. So we would implement UK arms export controls, and we put an end to exports where they might be used in violation of human rights and international human law. Ensure government procurement contracts are not granted to companies that are complicit in serious human rights abuses. And we would require all UK trade agreements to be consistent with international humanitarian law. We'd introduce legislation to ensure transparency and parliamentary scrutiny of trade and investment agreements, and then reject any trade agreements that undermine labour standards or environmental protections, and rule out UK export finance to support companies engaged in bribery and corruption. In Britain, we've played quite a large part in the world, and not all of that has been great. There's no harm in accepting that, realising it, learning from it. We need not just to do good, we need to not do bad.
Okay, and finally for the last word, and we go to Wendy.
We've talked a lot about trade, so I want to perhaps concentrate on an area that is really dear to the hearts of Liberal Democrats, which is human rights and civil liberties. So we know that a lot of abuses have gone on with people working abroad. We want to establish an easy and appropriate reporting mechanism for abuse that makes it clear that reporters and whistleblowers won't be discriminated against. We want to support a free media and free and open internet access for everybody in the world, championing the flow of free information. We want to protect journalists. We would like to see the BBC World Service expanded, providing informative and unbiased and trusted news around the world. We want to see the end of torture in the world. We want to see the end of the death penalty. We want to protect homosexuals who are discriminated against in far too many countries in the world. And we would champion LGBT plus rights. And we would have an ambassador level champion for freedom of belief, because we believe that human rights are a top priority for anything we do in the world. It's something that's been ignored for too long, and we need to do everything we can to make sure that other countries, people in other countries are able to enjoy the same rights that we have in this country.
Okay, that is unfortunately all we have time for this evening. I want to take the opportunity to thank the candidates again for coming, speaking to us, and taking up time out of their campaign schedule. If we can show our appreciation in the usual manner. I also just want to say thank you to the kind of audio tech guys who've helped set up the microphones and the cameras, to Charlie for organising the hustings, and to you guys for coming and for submitting your questions in advance as well. So obviously, please remember to vote next Thursday.
Well, one thing we know, none of us will be elected.